we're going to talk just a little bit more about correcting for externalities and different views on how those can be corrected, and also other types of market failure. So when we left off in class, we had discussed a little bit about how to correct for externalities, but we hadn't gotten to this, where, of course, government intervention is a popular strategy, but there are multiple types of government intervention. There's not just one type of government intervention. So when you're thinking about dealing with a negative externality, for example, the government can use what we call direct controls, where they can actually limit the pollutants, right? Or they can, so they can tell each firm, you can emit no more than this, and they can fine them or shut them down if they don't follow that. They can also mandate cleanups, so they can say, you must clean up this particular site. Of course, sometimes what happens is the firms actually go bankrupt, and then there's no one to pay the bill or to do the cleanup. So another way to do it is to have the government tax pollutants, or tax all of us, and use that to pay for the cleanup. And so Superfund is an example of that. Superfund sites are sites where the federal government has taken over at least part of the cleanup costs and the actual doing of the cleanup. Another solution, and this is for positive externalities, is to use subsidies. So the government can subsidize either buyers or sellers in order to provide the allocatably efficient amount of the good. And of course, which one you use, if you subsidize buyers, you're going to have a higher price, and it would be a more accurate reflection of what the market should look like. If you subsidize sellers, you'll have a lower price, and so there's a market distortion in terms of price, but you would have the allocatably efficient output. So immunizations and public education are examples of that. The government does provide immunizations to some people. They actually treat them as a public good. And same with public education. So it's really a subsidy to the sellers. But if you had a voucher system, that would be a subsidy to the buyers. Subsidizing a good with positive externalities is not the same thing as providing a public good. Providing a public good, or determining that you want to provide something as if it were a public good, requires actually taxing people, and then the government actually pays for the provision. So in the case of education, providing education as public good means the government builds the schools, pays the teachers, etc., which is what goes on right now. But if you were subsidizing education to try to overcome the externality problem, you would make payments to either schools, for example, maybe charter schools, or you would give parents vouchers. So slightly different way of approaching an externality problem. This is another way, and this is the market for externality rights, and I mentioned it, but we really didn't have a chance to talk about it. When you have a market with negative externalities, one way to do it is to try to somehow create property rights that may not already exist. And it's sort of an interesting approach. It's a little bit different from the Coase theorem. So this is a really good example of it. If you imagine we have this lake, and we'll just call it Lake Happy. It's not a real place. And it has beaches, as you can see, and people live near there. But there are also factories on Lake Happy, which it's a very large lake. Don't think of it like Turtle Lake. Think closer to Lake Superior or something, but it's somewhere in between. So the 4 firms that operate on Lake Happy together emit 32 tons of HW700 per day into the lake, which is killing fish, and it's harming tourism. But we don't know exactly which firms are emitting how much. So it makes for a little bit of an enforcement problem. So the government's decided that it wants to limit the ambient concentration of HW700 in the lake. We want to keep it at acceptable levels, and they've determined that no more than 16 tons per day can be safely emitted. So how can we achieve that 16-ton reduction? How can we get these firms to reduce? So if we were in class, I would have you brainstorm this, but since we're not, I will just remove this screen. Okay, some typical ideas that people come up with are try to get each firm to reduce their pollution by 50%, mandate it. Have each firm reduce its pollution by 4 units. And that's different because the 4 units, right? One firm might be emitting only 4 units, another firm might be emitting, say, 16, right? So if you have each firm reduce pollution by 50%, then each firm would be responsible for 50% of its emissions. If it was each firm by 4 units, that might play out differently. You could also just impose a tax on each firm, and the government could clean the lake. Or you could develop a new technology and require each firm to use it. So we could walk through, the different costs of each, and it's kind of a fun simulation if you have time to do it, because what happens is there are actually there's actually data about each firm, okay, and it looks like this. And if we were doing it as a simulation, we'd have 4 different people representing each one would represent a firm, and they would know the cost of cleanup, how many units of pollution they're emitting, and what it would cost to clean up their pollution. So you can see Acme doesn't have nearly as much pollution as widgets or cogs or even gadgets, right? Acme has much less, and it would be really cheap for them to clean up their pollution. So if we told them cut it in half, right, it would cost them $3,000. If we told them eliminate by 4, it would cost them $4,000. Either way, not a big deal, right? But if we told widgets to cut their pollution in half, they'd have to cut 5 units, and it would cost them $11,000. So the impact would be quite a bit different, and we could calculate the impact of different policies on each company. What we want to do, though, as economists, is we want to figure out what's the most efficient way to clean up. And it's pretty obvious, right? You want to clean up the units of pollution that are the cheapest to clean up. So if you want to cut out half the pollution, what you look for is, what are the cheapest units? Well, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? 9, 10, 11. Okay, now we're back to here. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. We cleaned up half the pollution, and we did it in the most cost-efficient way possible. Right? We don't force anybody to clean up a unit of pollution that costs $15,000 or $25,000 to clean up. This is the best outcome, but how do we get it? We can't get these companies to necessarily reveal this information about themselves. So economists have developed a system, which is basically permit auctions, to try to get at this. So what you do in a permit auction is you can either issue or sell permits to pollute. So one way is to issue each firm 4 permits, and they can either use them or sell them. So Acme, right, if they get 4 permits, they would probably, because it's so cheap for them to clean up the pollution, they would probably just clean up all their pollution and try to sell the permits to other firms. Because if you look at widgets, actually let's not look at widgets, let's look at cogs. Cogs gets 4 pollution permits. Well, obviously they're going to keep on polluting this 50,000. They can't clean that up. That's super expensive, right? And they're going to apply those pollution permits to those 4 units. Now they either have to clean up the rest, which would cost $20,000, right? Or they have to buy permits for the rest. Well, what they'd really like to do is maybe just clean up these first 2 units and buy permits for the others. Buying permits for the others would cost them $16,000. They could offer this other, sorry, I'm forgetting the name of this firm. They could offer this very clean and cheap firm. They could offer Acme $16,000 for 2 permits. Well, Acme could spend $2,000 to clean up pollution and sell the permit. So this would allow the permits through a free market to flow to the firms who need them the most. And that way, the pollution that would get cleaned up would be the cheap units, and the permits would be allocated to clean up the most expensive units. So it's a pretty cool idea, and this is actually what the government adopted, thanks to the recommendation of economists, for sulfur pollution. In the 80s, everyone was very concerned about acid rain, and economists proposed that we could actually auction sulfur permits, and that whoever has the most expensive cleanup would be the person or the firm that would actually buy the sulfur permits. And the rest of people would actually clean up instead. So every firm would have this decision to make. Do we clean up or do we buy a permit? Which one's going to be more expensive? And it was very successful. Okay, most economists, and I believe also environmentalists, credit this for reducing acid rain. And you're going to actually go online and look at the sulfur permit auction site. There's a lot of econ students who actually buy, as part of their class, they buy sulfur permits. So if you go buy a sulfur permit, what happens is that's 1 less unit of sulfur that someone can actually pollute. So it's an interesting economic solution. But carbon permits, as you probably know, have hit a lot of political resistance. People do not like the idea of carbon permits. They think that it would harm the economy. So the key is to clean up as long as the marginal benefit of the cleanup exceeds the marginal cost of the cleanup. And to remember that it's not actually efficient to clean up all pollution. So that's a little bit of a look at permit markets. I also just want to spend a minute talking about these other failures, other market failures that are more general, and we don't really graph these ones. So number 1 is asymmetric information. This is an information failure. Markets assume complete information, especially perfect competition assumes perfect information, which means the buyers really understand what they're getting. And you know, we don't necessarily know. So for example, if the government didn't regulate weights or measures or inspect gas pumps, we wouldn't know exactly what was in the gas. We would be counting on the person who's selling it to us to be telling us the truth. So the government steps in frequently to deal with asymmetric information. There's also a lot of tools that companies use. So for example, when a firm is hiring a new employee, they want the employee to be the best. The employee presents themselves as the best, but they might not actually be the best, right? You could have a great resume and a great interview and actually be a really lazy person. So firms actually use what we call screening tools, like college GPAs, leadership positions, that sort of thing, to be able to make up for these information failures. Okay, the second one is moral hazard, and this is the tendency of a party to alter their behavior after they sign a contract. So, for example, government insurance on bank deposits can actually encourage banks to go make risky loans because they've signed this contract, they know they're insured, now they feel free to do whatever. You could think of a person also, you know, buying health insurance and then starting smoking or going skydiving, right? That's moral hazard. So you signed a contract and now you feel free to behave in a different manner. And the last one is adverse selection. And this is the idea that markets don't work well for some goods, in particular health insurance. If we had a totally privatized health insurance market, we would have some firms selling health insurance and we would have some people buying health insurance. But there's an adverse selection problem because only the people who really expect to use health insurance would buy it, right? Healthy people probably wouldn't buy it, unhealthy people would, and then it becomes a really problematic market, right, for the insurance companies because they're going to have this huge distrust of anybody who would actually buy health insurance and assume that they're going to be very sickly and charge them a lot of money. So this adverse selection problem is the reason that under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, that they actually compel Americans, all people, to have health insurance because it should broaden the pool and make it sort of less risky for the firms. All right, so that's the end of our notes for this week.